Ethan Sterling was the golden boy of Manhattan. At 34, he sat atop a glass empire called Apex Vision. He was 12 hours away from a federal board presentation that would launch the Teacher AI, a billion-dollar software designed to revolutionize American schools. He was the man with all the answers, until the clock struck 11 p.m. In a freak server surge, a catastrophic glitch didn't just crash his system, it wiped it. Years of research, the proprietary source code, and every single backup were gone. In the blink of an eye, the billionaire was a fraud. He had no presentation, no product, and by tomorrow morning, he would have no company. Unable to face the cold silence of his penthouse, Ethan walked aimlessly through the rain, ending up in a dimly lit, 24-hour laundromat in a rough corner of Queens. He sat on a plastic bench, staring at his blank laptop screen, the reflection of his own defeated face staring back. "You look like a man who just watched the world end, sugar," a voice called out. Ethan looked up. Standing by a row of humming dryers was Sarah Miller. She was in her late 30s, wearing the faded green scrubs of a hospital cleaning crew. Her hair was pulled back, her eyes tired but sharp. Beside her, sitting on a pile of laundry, was her 10-year-old son, Leo. The boy didn't look up. He was hunched over a tattered sketchbook, drawing with a feverish intensity. "Close," Ethan muttered. "I just lost $1 billion. Sarah didn't blink. "Money is just paper we use to buy our way through the day. My boy here is nonverbal. The school says he's unreachable. I spend my nights scrubbing floors just to pay for a specialist who tells me my son is a lost cause. That's a real loss, mister. Your $1 billion is just a math problem." Ethan started to snap back, but his eyes fell on Leo's sketchbook, which had fallen to the floor. As Ethan reached down to retrieve it, he stopped. His heart skipped. The pages weren't filled with doodles. They were filled with complex, biological neural maps. It was a visual language, a way to bridge the gap between thought and speech using color-coded geometric nodes. It was more advanced than the AI Ethan had spent 3 years building. "Who taught him this?" Ethan whispered. "Nobody," Sarah said, her voice protective. "The principal, Mr. Henderson, wants to move him to a containment facility. He says Leo is a drain on the school's average." But Leo doesn't see the world in ABCs. He sees it in patterns. In that moment, Ethan realized why his AI had failed. It was built by elite engineers who didn't understand the children they were trying to fix. He looked at Sarah, a woman the world treated as invisible, and realized she held the key to everything. "Sarah," Ethan said, his voice trembling, "if you come with me to the board meeting tomorrow, if you let me show them how Leo sees the world, I can save my company. And I can make sure nobody ever calls your son unreachable again." The next morning, the Apex Vision boardroom was a sea of expensive suits and judgmental glares. Vance Thorne, the lead investor and a man who valued profit over people, stood at the head of the table. "The servers are empty, Ethan," Vance sneered. "You've wasted our time and our capital. Security is waiting to escort you out." "I don't have the software," Ethan announced, his voice echoing. "Because the software was wrong. We were trying to build a robot to teach a child. We should have been building a bridge to hear them." The doors opened, and Sarah walked in. She was still in her hospital scrubs, her hand gripped tightly by Leo. The board members whispered in shock. "A janitor in the inner sanctum of $1 billion firm." "This is Sarah Miller," Ethan said. "She cleans the halls of the hospitals you own. And this is her son, Leo. Your system says he's worth nothing. But he solved the logic bridge your engineers couldn't find in 3 years." Vance Thorne laughed, a cold, mocking sound. "You're bringing a cleaning lady's kid to a high-level tech summit? This is a joke. But Leo didn't wait for permission. He walked to the $50,000 digital whiteboard and took the stylus. With a steady hand, he drew a single, breathtakingly complex fractal, the missing link in the neural architecture. The lead engineer in the room gasped, dropping his tablet. He just mapped the auditory bypass. Sarah stepped forward, standing at the head of the table where Vance Thorne once stood. You walk past people like me every day, she said, her voice steady and clear. You look at my son and see a problem to be hidden. But we are the ones who see the gaps you're too busy to notice. You don't need more code. You need more heart. The room was silent. The invisible woman had just schooled the masters of the universe. Vance Thorne was voted out of the chairmanship that afternoon. Ethan didn't just save Apex. He transformed it into the Miller Sterling Collective. Sarah was appointed as the Director of Community Integration, and the Leo Lens became the first tool in history to give nonverbal children a digital voice. Ethan Sterling remained a billionaire, but he moved his office from the penthouse to a community center in Queens. He learned that his wealth wasn't measured by his bank balance, but by the fact that he was finally able to see the genius the rest of the world walked past. Sarah Miller never scrubbed another floor, but she kept her green scrubs in a glass case in her new office, a reminder that the most powerful person in the room is often the one holding the mop. The success of the Miller Sterling Collective was a shockwave that rattled the tech industry, but as the first year passed, Sarah realized that a new office and a high-level title hadn't changed the world outside, it had only made the enemies more sophisticated. While the Leo Lens was being adopted by schools across New York, a rival tech conglomerate, Nexus Global, launched a predatory lawsuit. They claimed that because Leo had used a stylus on a Sterling-owned whiteboard to solve the logic bridge, the intellectual property belonged to the shareholders, not the boy. They wanted to take the lens, put it behind a $10,000 a year paywall, and turn Sarah's mission into an elite luxury. Vance Thorne, the man Ethan had ousted, was behind the move. He didn't want the money. He wanted to prove that a janitor's son couldn't beat the system. Ethan was terrified. Sarah, their legal team is the best in the world. If we lose this, they'll take Leo's work and lock it away. They're offering a settlement, $50 million to walk away and let them have the rights. Sarah looked at the $50 million check on the desk. It was more money than she could earn in 1,000 lifetimes of scrubbing floors. Then she looked at Leo, who was sitting on the floor of the office, helping a 5-year-old girl use the lens for the first time. The girl had just typed the word, "Mommy," and her mother was weeping with joy. If we take the money, Ethan, we become the people we used to hate, Sarah said. We don't settle. We go to court. The trial became a media circus. The janitor versus the giants. On the final day of testimony, the courtroom was packed. Vance Thorne's lawyers tried to paint Sarah as an opportunist and Leo as a statistical anomaly who didn't understand what he had drawn. The boy is nonverbal, the lawyer sneered at the stand. He cannot explain his work. He cannot testify. He is a tool, not a creator. The judge looked at Sarah. Does the defense have anything to add? Sarah stood up. She wasn't wearing the designer suit Ethan had bought her. She had put on her old green hospital scrubs. Your Honor, she said, her voice echoing through the silent chamber. You say my son cannot testify because he has no voice. But you're wrong. He's been speaking to us this whole time. We just weren't smart enough to listen. She walked to the evidence table and picked up a tablet equipped with a Leo lens. She handed it to the court bailiff and asked him to give it to Leo. Leo, Sarah whispered, her eyes glistening. Tell the judge who the lens belongs to. The courtroom held its breath. Leo's fingers danced across the screen. A moment later, a synthesized voice, clear and resonant, filled the room. It wasn't a computer's voice. It was a recording of Leo's own laughter, modulated into speech. "The lens belongs to the girl in the third row," the tablet spoke. "It belongs to the boy who is scared of the bells. It belongs to everyone who has a secret they cannot say. It is not a product. It is a key. You cannot own a key to someone else's heart." The silence that followed was absolute. The judge, a man known for his ironclad adherence to the law, took off his glasses and wiped his eyes. The ruling was historic. The judge didn't just dismiss the lawsuit, he declared Leo's neural maps open source human heritage, meaning no corporation could ever own them. They belong to the world. Nexus Global stock plummeted overnight. Vance Thorne disappeared from the public eye, his reputation in tatters. Ethan and Sarah stood on the steps of the courthouse, surrounded by hundreds of parents holding up signs with Leo's geometric drawings. "What now?" Ethan asked, feeling smaller, but happier than he had ever been as a billionaire. Sarah looked at the crowd, the janitors, the bus drivers, the teachers, and the lost cause, kids who were now speaking to one another. 5 years later, the world had changed, but the pressure had reached a boiling point. The Miller Sterling Collective was no longer just a project. It was a threat to the global education industrial complex. While millions of children were now using the Leo lens for free, the massive corporations that sold standardized tests and expensive textbooks were losing billions. They decided that if they couldn't own Leo's mind, they would destroy his mother's reputation. A shadowy group of investors launched a smear campaign. They dug into Sarah's past, finding an old, minor debt from when she was a struggling teenager and twisted it to look like financial fraud. They leaked documents claiming Ethan had used the nonprofit to dodge taxes. The goal was simple: freeze their assets and force the collective into a government-mandated receivership, where the tech could be sold off to the highest bidder. One morning, Sarah arrived at the center to find federal agents taping, seized, notices to the doors. "Sarah, they've frozen everything," Ethan said, pacing the sidewalk. "The lawyers, the server costs, the staff's salaries. We have 48 hours before the lens goes offline globally. If the servers go dark, millions of nonverbal kids lose their voices instantly. It'll be like they were plunged back into a dark room." Sarah looked at the agents. She looked at the parents standing at the gate, clutching their tablets in fear. Then she looked at Ethan. "They think we need a building to be a movement," Sarah said, a familiar fire in her eyes. "They think we need a bank account to be a family. They've forgotten where we started." Sarah didn't call a lawyer. She called the network. She sent out one final message through the Leo Lens app before the servers were scheduled to shut down. "The gatekeepers are trying to lock the doors. If you believe the truth belongs to everyone, meet us at the steps of the National Education Department tomorrow at dawn. Bring your tablets. Bring your voices." The next morning, the scene in Washington, D.C. was unlike anything the city had ever seen. It wasn't a protest of shouts and signs. It was a protest of silence. 5,000 children, all nonverbal or neurodivergent, stood on the National Mall. Beside them stood the janitors, the nurses, the waitresses, and the invisible workers of America. When the Secretary of Education stepped out to address the crowd, he expected a riot. Instead, he found a sea of children holding up their tablets. At exactly 9 a.m., the time the servers were supposed to be cut, the children hit play at the same time. A symphony of 5,000 synthesized voices rose into the air, perfectly synchronized. They didn't scream. They recited a poem Leo had written. "I am not a glitch in your system. I am the light you forgot to measure. You can seize the building, but you cannot seize the breath. You can freeze the money, but you cannot freeze the truth. The sound was so haunting, so powerful, that traffic in the capital stopped. News cameras from every network captured the sight of the Secretary of Education breaking down in tears on the steps. By noon, the President of the United States issued an executive order. The smear campaign was exposed as a corporate hit job. The Education Freedom Act was drafted on the spot, ensuring that any tech created for human accessibility would be protected from corporate seizure forever. Ethan and Sarah returned to New York not as CEO and director, but as icons. The collective was now protected by the people, funded by small donations from millions of parents who refused to let the light go out. The final scene of the story takes us back to that same Queen's laundromat. Sarah is sitting there, older now, her hands still scarred from years of scrubbing, but her heart full. Ethan is beside her, no longer wearing a suit, just a simple hoodie. Leo, now 15, stands up from his drawing. He doesn't use the tablet this time. He walks over to Sarah, takes her hand, and for the first time in his life, his vocal cords vibrate with a sound he has practiced for 5 years. "Thank you, Mom." It was a small, raspy whisper. It wasn't perfect, like the AI software. It was messy, it was difficult, and it was the most beautiful thing Ethan Sterling had ever heard. The billionaire realized then that Sarah had been right all along. You don't need $1 billion to change the world. You just need to be brave enough to step into the smoke and start digging until you find the person the world told you wasn't there. 10 years after the Symphony of Silence, in Washington, D.C., the world had entered a new era. The Miller Sterling Collective had become the global standard for education, and the Leo lens was now as common as a pencil in classrooms from Brazil to Bangkok. But as Sarah and Ethan approached their twilight years in the movement, they faced their final and most personal challenge, the legacy crisis. Ethan, now 50, sat in the sun-drenched garden of the collective's headquarters. He was watching Leo, now a 25-year-old visionary, lead a team of young engineers. But the atmosphere was tense. A new generation of tech moguls, young, aggressive, and disconnected from the laundromat days, were trying to optimize the collective. They wanted to integrate Leo's maps into brain implants, promising instant intelligence. "They want to bypass the struggle, Sarah," Ethan said, looking at a proposal on his desk. "They say learning to speak is inefficient. They want to turn your son's soul into a high-speed data port." Sarah, whose hair was now streaked with silver, but whose eyes remained like flint, looked at the sleek young executives waiting in the glass conference room. They reminded her of the Ethan she had met 15 years ago, men who thought the world was a machine to be tuned, rather than a garden to be tended. "Efficiency is the enemy of humanity, Ethan," she said. "If you take away the struggle, you take away the victory." The conflict came to a head at the Global Human Summit. The new tech elites had prepared a demonstration. They brought out a young boy, similar to how Leo had been, and showed how their new Neuralink could make him solve calculus in seconds. The crowd cheered. It looked like a miracle. Then, they asked Sarah Miller to give her blessing. Sarah walked onto the stage. She didn't look at the cameras or the billionaires. She looked at the young boy with the implant. He looked perfect. He looked fast. But his eyes looked vacant. He was a passenger in his own mind. "When I met Ethan Sterling," Sarah began, her voice carried by the same quiet power that had moved the world a decade prior, "he was a man who had lost his code. He thought his life was over because his computer was empty. But he found my son in a laundromat. He found a boy who couldn't speak, but who was fighting every single day to be heard." She turned to the tech moguls. "What you have built is a fast car. But what we built was a pair of legs. You want to give these children a ride, but we wanted to teach them how to walk. My son's first word took 15 years to say. It was raspy, it was broken, and it was the greatest achievement in human history because he said it. Not a chip. Not an algorithm. Him. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the tattered, yellowed sketchbook Leo had used as a child. If you automate the soul, you kill the person. The Miller-Sterling Collective is officially withdrawing from all neural implant research. We are returning to the kitchen table. We are returning to the struggle. The tech elites were furious. They threatened to pull all funding. They predicted the collective would become a relic of the past. But that night, as Sarah and Ethan walked through the streets of Queens, they saw something that proved them right. In a small park, they saw a group of children using the old Leo lens. They weren't solving calculus. They were laughing. They were struggling to find the right words to tell a joke. They were frustrated, they were thinking, and they were alive. The story ends back where it began. Not in a boardroom, and not in a palace. Ethan, Sarah, and a grown-up Leo sat in that same 24-hour laundromat. The machines were newer, and the lights were brighter, but the feeling was the same. Leo was showing Sarah a new drawing. It wasn't a neural map this time. It was a portrait of Sarah, scrubbing a floor, with a golden light emanating from the mop. Leo leaned over and whispered, no longer raspy, but clear and strong. The world is always going to try to find a faster way, Mom. But I like the long way. Because the long way is where I found you. Ethan smiled, realizing that his greatest investment wasn't the billions he had made, but the $40 he had been short. On the night, he met a woman who taught a billionaire how to be a human being. The screen fades to black with a final message. Genius is not found in the speed of the answer, but in the courage to ask the question. Dedicated to the ones the world walks past. As the years matured into decades, Ethan Sterling's name vanished from the Forbes list of the world's wealthiest men. To the financial world, he was a mystery, a titan who walked away from a trillion-dollar industry. But to the streets of Queens and the classrooms of Harlem, he was simply Ethan, the man who learned to listen. Sarah Miller never left the neighborhood that raised her. She established the Miller Endowment for Hidden Genius, a foundation that didn't look for the top 1% of students, but specifically sought out the bottom 1%, the children labeled unreachable by the state. She turned the very hospital where she once scrubbed floors into a world-renowned neurodiversity research center, where the board of directors consisted entirely of former janitors, teachers, and stay-at-home parents. The final scene of the story takes place on a warm autumn evening. A grand ceremony is being held at the National Cathedral to honor the 25th anniversary of the Leo lens. The world's elite are there, but Sarah and Ethan are nowhere to be found on the VIP list. Instead, they are found back at the 24-hour laundromat, now preserved as a community historical site. They are sitting with a new generation of parents, mothers in uniforms, fathers with calloused hands, all of whom are watching their children navigate the world with a confidence that was once considered impossible. Ethan looks at Sarah, then at Leo, who is now a father himself, teaching his own daughter how to draw patterns in the steam on the laundromat window. You know, Ethan says quietly, I spent the first half of my life trying to build a machine that could think. I almost missed the fact that the most beautiful thoughts were already happening right in front of me. Sarah smiles, leaning her head on his shoulder. The world is always going to try to automate the soul, Ethan. It's cheaper that way. But as long as there's a mother with a sketchbook and a kid who refuses to be quiet, they'll never win. Now, Sarah said, handing her old green scrubs to a young mother in the crowd who was struggling with her own son's backpack. We build the schools. not the ones with the high walls and the expensive gates. We build the ones where the genius is allowed to be messy, and the janitor is the most important teacher in the building. The Miller Sterling Collective became the first nonprofit to be valued at $10 billion, not because of its bank account, but because of the millions of voices it had unlocked. And every night, after the office lights went out, Ethan and Sarah would sit in that same old laundromat in Queens, folding clothes and listening to Leo read them stories, not in code, not in math, but in the beautiful and perfect language of a boy who was finally home.